Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here, and I understand that I'm the bridge between two conferences, one which had a labor component, a subject near and dear, and one about finance, which I know nothing about. So I want to speak today about technological change and artificial intelligence, but I want to put it in the context of other technological revolutions we've been through in the last 2 centuries. And so the unifying thesis and idea of my talk will be about expertise and its relationship to technological change and how that has changed over time. But let me start with a very simple point. So the year is 2021. These are recent photographs. And here's a young woman weaving in an ancient loom in India. Here are young men mining cobalt in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Notice no respirators, no helmets, no pickaxes, no headlights. So now I was at a conference recently, and the thesis was it's 2034, and transformative AI enables machines to do virtually all the tasks humans currently do. Let's imagine how their jobs are transformed. That's right, not at all. Right? And the reason is, of course, that those jobs could already have been automated, or they could have been using better tools for decades, right? We've had better looms, we've had pickaxes and respirators. They weren't used because labor was too cheap. And there are many things that could be automated that are not automated because labor is not scarce. And in fact, labor scarcity is one of the great accomplishments of the modern industrial world. You might think that in countries where we have so much capital and so much technology and so much infrastructure that labor would be a small part of modern economies. But the opposite is true. In North America, more than 60% of all income is paid to labor. The worldwide average is only 53%. In parts of North Africa, it's as low as 45%. So in other words, in our modern history, we have used technology in a way that is complementary to our skills and made labor more valuable. And labor scarcity, the value of labor, is the backbone of the labor market. It's also, in my opinion, the backbone of democracies, and we should value it. And it's not something we want to eliminate. So let's talk about that. What makes labor valuable? The way I'm going to define terms is expertise. Expertise is what makes labor valuable in countries where a lot of physical work can be done by machines. So expertise, defined terms, means domain-specific knowledge or competency that allows you to accomplish some specific set of tasks. For it actually to have market value, you need 2 things. One is the goal, the task it accomplishes must itself be valuable. So it's got to be, data science, not card tricks. The other thing is it must be scarce. To paraphrase the character Panic in the movie Incredibles, if everyone is expert, no one is expert, right? Expertise depends on scarcity intrinsically. So why should we care? The reason you should care is because non-expert work pays poorly. So consider these 2 jobs, crossing guard, air traffic controller. These are basically the same job, right? The job is to prevent things from colliding with one another, airplanes with other airplanes, cars with children. And yet, the crossing guard gets paid less than 1/4 of what the air traffic controller gets paid. Why is that? It's not because they don't do socially valuable work, right? If we had to pay $130,000 a year to prevent children from being hit by cars on the way to school, we'd spend that money, right? The difference is scarcity, it's expertise. To become a crossing guard in the United States requires almost no certification or training. Any adult of sound mind and body can do this job. To become an air traffic controller takes years in air traffic control college, and then hundreds to thousands of hours of practice before you can do this work, right? So the reason it's paid more is because the expertise is scarce. So let me talk about scarcity of labor and different eras in which different types of expertise were valuable. So prior to mass production, most skilled work that wasn't in agriculture was artisanal work, where basically people made things by hand from end to end, right? So you could be a blacksmith, or you could be a tailor, or a farrier, or a wheelwright. And this was labor-intensive work. It was extremely skilled. Most people apprenticed into this work, right? They would, buy the tools from, or get the tools from a family member, or they would sell themselves into indentured to become an artisan, and they were highly revered. The Industrial Revolution was a new way of organizing work, and it wiped out artisanal work, right? The idea of the Industrial Revolution, it wasn't just technology. It was a way of organizing work where you took machines, educated managers, and almost unskilled labor to do repetitive tasks at high frequency and with no discretion, right? It took none of the expertise of artisans. And it was a tough time. The first 60 years of the Industrial Revolution, productivity rose a lot, but as far as historians can measure it, wages of the working class did not, right? This transition from artisanal work to mass production was not a positive transition in its early phases. And this figure you see here of people working in an early textile factory, there are a couple things about it that are representative. One, of course, is all the managers are men. All the workers would have been unmarried young women or children who were sold into indenture to do this work. It was dirty. It was dangerous. You were quite likely to lose a finger or a limb. The hours were excruciating, and the working conditions were terrible, and the pay was poor. But that was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and that's the type of work that went on. This eventually changed. Starting around the late 19th century, we moved into what people call the Second Industrial Revolution, and it required a different skill set. As the technology for production became more complex, the materials became more valuable, the expectations of quality changed. You needed workers who had some expertise. They needed people who could basically master rules, follow rules, and master tools. It, in many cases, required literacy. It required numeracy. So it was quite complementary to the skills that were being increasingly produced by the school system. And you could see this, what I'm going to call mass expertise. You could see it on the factory floor in the Ford assembly line, but you could also see it in the office, right? A lot of the mass production techniques that came out of factories were adopted by business to run clerical work, to run administrative work, for accounting, and so on. And from roughly 1880 to 1980, this way of organizing work, initially so disruptive, became quite productive and really helped build the middle class of the industrializing world. But that begins to change again in the early 1980s with the era of computing, and particularly ubiquitous personal computing. So let me start with a picture of my first PC, which was the Jacquard Loom of 1800. Okay, it's not a PC. But it's the first industrial computer. And what made it distinct from other machines was it's a symbolic processor. It could act, analyze, and interpret instructions. So what you see is punch cards that contain instructions to the loom for which hooks to move and which threads to use to weave patterns. So it's not a weave by number or weave pattern. Those are actually coded instructions. This was a really powerful idea. Herman Holrith adopted it. He created the paper punch card, which was used to read the 1890 US Census, the first machine-read census of populations. Then he joined forces with Thomas Watson to form IBM. And so the incredible power of this technology is it could follow rules, a lot like workers, right? If the instruction could be fully codified in such a way that they required no discretion, no problem solving, right? No improvisation, just a machine that could do tasks repetitively at high speed, this was an amazing tool. And what made it particularly amazing is the cost of doing this fell a trillion-fold between 1950 and 2000, right? According to the work of Bill Nordhaus, right, the cost of carrying out 1 million calculations, which had been basically flat for 100 years because more people could do it, but the cost of labor was rising, then fell like this. And so this created enormous incentive to replace labor with machines in tasks that could be carried out by following sets of rules. In other words, by following rules and mastering tools. And so this had a big effect on hollowing out the labor market, We see this in the US, we see this throughout the industrialized world, not in developing countries, where jobs of production and operative and clerical, administrative support and sales jobs that were skilled, that required expertise, that a lot of the expertise could be codified and done by machines. So this was not good for people who had that mass expertise class, the people who had, in the earlier era, benefited from the Industrial Revolution, were now found themselves, not the same people, displaced from those jobs. Or slowly, but certainly, and over time, quite dramatically. Now you might ask, okay, you see it hollowing out the middle, but why not the ends? Like, why not the management, professional, technical work? Why not the clerical and cleaning and fixing work? Well, the answer comes to what some call Polanyi's paradox, after the philosopher Michael Polanyi, who said, we know more than we can tell, right? Many of the tasks we do, we actually don't know the rules for doing them, right? So, if you want to create a persuasive argument or develop a good hypothesis or tell a joke, or you want to ride a bicycle or, build something out of wood, we don't know the rules for that, right? It's a task that requires based on what we call tacit understanding, what Polanyi called tacit understanding. Like, just to give an example of a bicycle, right? Many of you will have children, and you will have taught them how to ride a bicycle, but you didn't teach them by getting up and explaining the principles of gyroscopic physics and how the bike works, right? You put them on the bicycle on a gentle hill, and you gave them a push, and you said, good luck, dear, and you hope that worked out, right? And that's because you have to learn that knowledge tacitly, not explicitly, right? And so the implication of that is that we can't computerize tasks that we don't explicitly understand. In the pre-AI era, right, where we had to write explicit rules, it placed a hard constraint on the tasks that could be automated, right? So you see this hollowing out, right? Those tasks in the middle, they were educated tasks, but they followed formal rules that were understood deductively, formally. It was great it was very complementary to people who worked in the professions, because access to better information, access to calculation, so on, it makes you better at your main job, which is making decisions. If you're, on the other hand, if you were in the services, it didn't have much of an impact, but it did have an indirect impact, right? Because it pushed people out of the middle and into those service occupations, food service, cleaning, security, entertainment, recreation. Again, socially valuable work, but not expert work, because most people can do it without training or certification. So it was low-paid work. And we see this polarization of earnings and the decline in the bottom, especially in the United States. By the way, those are real earnings for high school dropout, high school grad, some college, college grad, greater than college, over decades. And this rise of inequality wasn't just rising earnings at the top, but falling earnings at the bottom. And that was partly the bifurcating effect of computerization. Now, there are many, many other factors I don't want to oversimplify, but this was an important contributor. Okay, that was the past. Let's talk about the present. So I want to talk about the potential of artificial intelligence, both sides, the potential to augment, the potential to displace. And I just want to say thematically, some people are very optimistic about AI. I think there are some are very pessimistic about AI. And I'm both. I think people are insufficiently optimistic about the upside, and some people are insufficiently concerned about the downside. And I think they coexist. And so we should see that there's a lot of range here. Let me just start off. So artificial intelligence, as you know, can do things that were not feasible with traditional procedural computing, right? It can learn from unstructured, open-ended text. It can do tasks that we would think of as creative if they were done by people, like make these illustrations. It can discover and invent, right? These are things that we don't know the rules for, and neither does AI, right? It does them inductively, learning from examples. It couldn't explain to you why it's doing what it's doing. It's kind of the opposite of Polanyi's paradox. Polanyi's paradox is we know more than we can tell. This is what I call Polanyi's revenge, which is that AI knows more than it can tell us, right? It doesn't know why it's doing what it's doing, so it can't explain it. And just to give you a sense of how powerful this is, not that you need to be convinced, many of you will have heard of the critical assessment of protein structure prediction competition. So what this is structural genetics, or structural biology, you need to know the structure of proteins to understand their interaction with the body, how they bind with cells, their medicinal properties. For most proteins, structural biologists will know the amino acid sequence, but that's not the important information. The important information is the shape of the protein when it folds up, which is an extremely complex function of all its molecular charges and so on. So figuring out the folding structure of a protein has been a huge task in structural biology for decades. And a single protein might be the basis of a dissertation or $1 million grant. Right? So this CASP competition was run every year to see how good people were getting at it. At the beginning of the competition, the person who ran it would give people the amino acid sequences, and then they'd have the weekend, and then had to come back and make a prediction about how it folded. In 2000, Google DeepMind entered a program called AlphaFold, and science declared in 2020 the game has changed. The founder of the protein competition said the following: "This is a 50-year-old problem. I never thought I'd see this in my lifetime." Right? So that's an amazing accomplishment. Right? And it's an amazing accomplishment because AI was able to learn from examples and make predictions that would be very difficult for people to make. So this is an incredible advance, not an incremental advance, really a qualitative change. Okay, so how do I want to think about this? Well, I want to start off by emphasizing that AI is a tool, like a calculator or a chainsaw. Right? And when we think about tools and expertise, in most cases, tools are not the enemy of expertise, they're the lever of expertise, right? Tools in general shorten the distance between intention and result, and they amplify the value of expertise, right? Many of us couldn't do our jobs without the tools that we use to do them, right? So imagine an air traffic controller without a GPS, a radar, and a two-way radio. It's just a person standing in the field staring at the sky, right? Couldn't do the job. If you're a medical doctor, if you didn't have instruments and tools and stethoscope and so on, you couldn't do your work, right? So in many cases, new tools amplify the value of human expertise. They take a specific amount of know-how and they allow you to go further with it. And so in general, we don't think of our tools as our competitors, right? We think of them as our agents. But that's not universally and always true. Another example that someone may be familiar with is London taxi drivers. So since 1865, to become a London taxi driver, you need to master what's called the knowledge, which is an elaborate feat of memorization to learn all the roads and highways and byways of London. It takes on average 34 months of study. Brain scans show that people's brains are actually physically recognizably changed by this act of memorization. And yet, when phone GPS routing was introduced, right, the knowledge all of a sudden became economically irrelevant, right? Because not only does the Waze know all the highways and byways and streets and thoroughfares of London, but it also knows how much traffic is on them at any given time, which is something you could never learn by memorization. Right? So it stranded this expertise, right? It commodified it. It made it less valuable because once that was mastered by a machine, the job is just driving, and anyone can drive, or at least everyone thinks they can drive. A friend of a friend is actually a London taxi driver, and he says, "I think of my job as an entertainer and a tour guide," right? Nothing to do with driving. Okay, so these represent polar examples, right? One is amplification of human expertise, and the other is commodification. And both of these will go on. So let me give examples of both to help you think about this. So first I want to stipulate, here's how I want to think of AI. AIs are tools that make recommendations and help you make decisions, right? So you're very familiar with them. They're all around you, right? So if your smartwatch asks you if you've taken a fall, or your car tries to guide you back into lane, or your word processing software offers to help you with your writing assignment, these are all examples of AI, right? It's watching what you're doing, it's trying to interpret it, and it's trying to help you do a better job of it, right? And this is all around us, right? And it's going to get much better. In the future, we will have machines whispering in our ears all the time, making recommendations, right? So how can this go right? How can it go wrong? Well, let me start off by how it can go wrong. So in June 1st of 2009, Air France Flight 447 left Rio de Janeiro on its way to Paris, and at 35,000 feet over the Atlantic, the pitot tubes froze. Those are just the speed sensors on the aircraft, and that happens. When it happened, the autopilot partially disengaged, as it is supposed to do. The plane rolled. In the confusion, the first officer stalled the plane. What it means to stall a plane is the wing of an aircraft creates lift by the Bernoulli effect, where wind goes under and over, and it takes longer to get over, and that's what creates lift. If the angle of attack becomes too steep, the Bernoulli effect fails, and the plane loses lift and eventually loses velocity. During the 3.5 minutes between the time the autopilot shut off and the plane crashed into the Atlantic, the crew never fully understood what was happening. The voice recorders have been recovered, and you can hear the autopilot saying, "Stall, stall, stall." And you can hear the crew saying, "What's happening? What is happening? I don't know what's happening." In the last seconds, the captain realized it was a mistake by the other crew member. The conclusion of the accident report was the crew lacked the experience in the attributes of high-altitude manual flying. So this is a negative interaction between an expert machine and an expert worker. Now, that's an extreme example, but let me give you a contemporaneous example that really has much of the same flavor. So this is a scan from a tool called Chexpert, or Chest Expert. It's a tool put out by Stanford, and you can tell from the name Chexpert that the organization does not have a marketing team, right? Because you'd never call it Chexpert. But it's a great application of AI, right? Because this system has read tens of thousands of scans, and they're labeled scans, and it learns what patterns are associated with what diagnoses, right? And there's no formal rules. Doctors don't have formal rules for this either, right? They have rules of thumb. They look at it, they develop experience, they develop judgment, and they make diagnoses. So, for example, this scan, it sees a likely case of edema and a very likely case of pneumonia, and those are circled. So this tool, using only x-rays without ancillary information, is as good as 60% of radiologists, right? And these things are used at scale presently. This is not a future version. This is used in diagnosis all the time nowadays. So you might think that this tool is pretty good and radiologists are pretty good, so the combination of the two would be even better. The opposite is true. Radiologists do worse with this tool than they do on their own. Why does that happen? The problem is correlated uncertainty. So when the machine makes a prediction, it also tells you how confident it is. Well, its prediction, its confidence is highly correlated with the radiologist's confidence, right? They're looking at the same scan, right? So when the machine is uncertain, the radiologist tends to be uncertain. When the machine is certain, the radiologist tends to be certain. So when there's uncertainty, more often than not, the radiologist defers to the machine. When there's certainty and they disagree, more often than not, the radiologist overrides the machine. Well, it turns out neither of those is a good call, right? In fact, when you're uncertain and the machine's uncertain, you probably should go with your own judgment because you have more context. When you're both confident but you disagree, you should at least ask yourself, why do I come to a different conclusion? But this is known because some of my colleagues and others, Nikhil Agarwal, Tobias Sauls, ran an experiment with radiologists, right? They didn't actually know they were part of this experiment. They were just getting paid their normal $1,000 an hour to read scans. They didn't realize these were existing scans. And so this was discovered. But radiologists would never have known otherwise. How would they? Because they don't get any feedback. No one, people said, this is a good tool, it works well, let's just give it to the radiologists. When you read a scan, there's no light that goes on that tells you if you were right or wrong, right? You just send the patient home or you send them for more care, and that's the end of it. So this is very similar to the autopilot in that you're putting in a sophisticated tool, it's going to operate at scale in a high-stakes situation, and people don't have the ability or the opportunity to develop the right judgment to use it well. It's not that this isn't a fixable problem, but the use of the tool is based on the assumption that if the tool is good, the result will be good, and that's not true. Okay, so now let me talk about the opposite side of this, the upside. I'm talking about augmenting human potential. So let me start with an example that actually has nothing to do with AI. So the occupation of nurse practitioner in the United States is a registered nurse who has an additional master's degree, 1 or 2 years of training and additional practice to become a nurse practitioner. There were very few of them 20 years ago. Now there's almost 250,000. It's a well-paid job. And what's remarkable about it is nurse practitioners do things that used to be done exclusively by medical doctors. They can diagnose, they can treat, they can prescribe pharmaceuticals, and that's a really unusual change where you have a very skilled worker, but not the leading expert, taking over tasks from an expert worker. It's great for patients, it's a great job. This is not because of technology, right? This actually happened because nurses recognized back in the 1960s they were underused, and they fought like hell to create a credential, a scope of practice, a training mechanism, and I guarantee you the American Medical Association fought them every step of the way to prevent this from happening, and they created this new occupation. But at this point, nurse practitioners are very heavily augmented by technology, right? They have access to electronic medical records, to diagnostic software, to prescription software that looks for drug interactions, right? And so the scope of what they can accomplish and their ability to do it well is increasing all the time. And it's easy to imagine a future, if the AMA allows it, where nurse practitioners will do a broader variety of tasks because they will have better tools. Right? And so in many cases, this tool can support decision making, right? It can give guidance, meaning look at these criteria, think about the following. It can give guardrails, don't prescribe those drugs together. Right? And that's a potential for augmenting expertise. And I want to emphasize, you wouldn't give this to just anyone and tell them to take care of patients, right? You have to have expertise to use it. I'll give you another concrete example, right? Let's say I want to do an electrical project in my house. Let's say I want to replace my fuse box from my 200-year-old house with a breaker box. It's a modern piece of technology. I can go on YouTube. There's hundreds of videos on how to do this. I don't know who makes those videos. I don't know why they make them, but there's a lot of them. And actually 60% of American adults report that they use YouTube to learn to do things they don't already know how to do. So let's imagine I have no electrical experience. I've never worn insulated gloves. I don't understand the principles of circuitry. I don't have electrical tape, but I live near a Home Depot, right? So I can go buy all that stuff, right? And just start working on my house, right? Well, you can, no matter how much YouTube I have, right? This is going to end badly, right? I'm going to set my house on fire. I'm going to electrocute myself, right? This is not going to work well. Okay, so that YouTube video is not for me. If I'm a master electrician, I don't need the video. I know how to do it already. Imagine I'm a person with some skills who understands electrical work but has never done a project that ambitious. I could probably do this with YouTube, right? The point is, this tool, YouTube, right, is a complement to expertise. You need expertise to use it well, right? For a true expert, maybe it'll save them time, maybe it's not needed. For someone who has no expertise, it's dangerous, right? But for someone with the right level of expertise, it's a complement. Okay, so do we see any examples like this? So the early evidence is early and thin, it's small. But let me give you an example. So this is a study, actually a now famous study done by our students Shaked Noy and Whitney Zhang about ChatGPT. And they basically hired people on Prolific, that's like a mechanical Turk for college graduates, to do 2 writing tasks. One was to write some advertising, one was to write a marketing plan. These are short tasks, they take about half an hour. And on the first task, everyone used their normal tools, which are word processors, Google, and so on. And then on the second task, half the group was randomly selected and said, hey, would you like to try ChatGPT 3.5? This is a year-old study. And about 80% of them took it up. So let's see what happened. So this first panel shows you the time spent on the task. So it took, for the control group that didn't use ChatGPT, it took about 25 minutes for each of these tasks. For the group that got ChatGPT, the time spent fell by about 40%, right? So it saved a lot of time. So that's pretty cool. Right. Second thing, they had hired another set of college graduates to evaluate the quality of the work. And this was a blinded experiment. They didn't know if this, what was what. And they evaluated for precision, for clarity, for conciseness, for accuracy. And the workers using ChatGPT, they were about a half a standard deviation better, right? So time spent went down, quality went up. But here's the most important thing. This figure shows you the relationship between people's score on the first task and on the second task. And the black line is for the people in the control group who didn't use ChatGPT, and the green is for those who did. And you notice this much shallower slope, right? So ChatGPT didn't really help the best writers, but it took the least effective writers and put them at about the median of the people not using this tool. So it reduced the inequality of skills. In other words, it helped people who were pretty good writers to be more effective writers, right? It didn't do all the writing, but it helped. And that's an unusual technology. Many technologies we think of as amplifying differences, and this is one that compress differences. Now, that may not be a representative example. Here's another one that I like a lot from my former colleague Eric Brynjolfsson, my colleague Danielle Lee, and her graduate student Lindsay Raymond. And they look at the use of a chatbot in a customer support setting. So the setting is basically an enterprise software company, and its customers run their businesses on this tool. And so when things don't go right, they go ask for help, and they're usually in a hurry. So they might say, I've got customers calling me all day, my website is down, I need this fixed ASAP. So what this chatbot does, what it doesn't do is answer the customer, right, which would just be annoying. Instead, it suggests possible answers to the agent who can then copy-paste them in or edit them or ignore them. So how did this work out? So the vertical axis of this picture is the number of calls that agents handle per hour. The horizontal axis is the number of months they've been on the job. So the people in blue never use this tool. And you can see that over the course of 10 months, they go from handling about 1.8 calls per hour to about 2.5 calls per hour, which is a substantial increase. Notice this is a lot of time, right? 20 to 30 minutes per call. This is serious work. The folks in green got access to this chatbot 6 months into their tenure. And you can see what happened, right? They overtook. The folks in red started using the chatbot right away, and they were doing better still. But I want you to notice is no one starts off good at this job, right? Everybody starts off badly, and what the technology does is it enables people to converge towards expertise more rapidly, right? They learn faster, they're more effective. The quality of output was about the same, wasn't dramatically changed, but one thing that did change, this is really interesting, is the quit rate went way down. You might say, why is that? Well, this is a hard job, right? You can imagine the setting, it's a little bit of a road rage setting, right? Where people are very upset and they're not very polite. and so text analysis of the chat log shows that the level of hostility from customers to workers and from workers to customers actually declined once this tool went into place. And it turns out the computer does a lot of the emotional labor. I was very surprised by this. I asked Danielle, I said, so what's the division of labor? The worker says, hi, how you doing? The computer gives the answer. She goes, oh no, just the opposite. The computer says, oh, I feel your pain. Oh, I've had this happen many times. And then the worker supplies the answer, right? So it's an interesting example. We have other examples. I think it's way too early to make any conclusions, right? First of all, these examples might be representative, might not be representative, right? Second, even if this is true, it doesn't mean everyone benefits. It depends. If everyone gets more productive, many things can happen, right? So here are the open questions, or some of the critical questions. One is, who's complemented? Does AI in general reduce the inequality of productivity? In some cases it will, in some cases it won't. We don't know what the central tendency is. It's too early. Who is substituted? With whom does this compete? Is it non-experts? Is it people who don't use the technology? Or is it actually the most expert people who are now not as scarce? And once this is happening at scale, what does that mean? Does it mean many people are more valuable, or does it mean that output is too cheap to meter, right? Everything is so cheap and easy, no one is, it's not scarce anymore, right? And that's possible, we don't know. So these are the questions to think about. So you might be asking me the following: will AI augment expertise or displace experts? And the actual answer to this question is, I don't know, right? So as my friend Josh Cohen, Apple University says, the future is not a forecasting problem, it's a design problem, right? It's not just that it's hard to predict, it's that this is up to us, right? The way we design work, the way the skills we need, the way the technology evolves will depend on how we build it out, what investments we make. So you can use technology in a large variety of ways. So one way you can use it is you can use it for surveillance, and you can use it for content filtering or censorship. And let me say, this is a remarkable technological achievement to be able to do that. It took a great deal of investment. I'm not kidding. The US is not as good at this technology, and it wouldn't be possible without AI. Right? Now, that doesn't mean that that's what AI does. That means that's what some people chose to do with it. Right? That's one way to build out the technology. You could also use it in a variety of other ways. You could use it to assist with elder care. You could use it to provide real-time information to workers who are doing repair, to make them, enable them to do a larger set of tasks. You could use it to make education more immersive, more accessible, less expensive, right? So there's a large set of possibilities, and they really depend on what people prioritize. Just give you one more example, right? In the 1930s, humanity mastered nuclear fission, controlled nuclear fission, and it has two really powerful applications. One is for weaponry, another is for energy generation. At present, North Korea has an incredible arsenal of nuclear weapons and no nuclear power plants. Japan, the only country against which offensive nuclear weapons has ever been used, has no nuclear weapons and dozens of nuclear power plants, right? That's not about the technology, that's about a choice of priorities. So we have a lot of choices to make. Okay, so let me end by talking about the end of work. You may be concerned that we're going to be running out of work, jobs. Why talk about expertise when we just need jobs? And you would not be alone if you had this concern. So here's Elon Musk. There'll come a point where no job is needed. Geoffrey Hinton, the father of neural nets, only slightly disagrees. He tells everyone to get a job as a plumber. So in the future, we'll have either no jobs or everyone will be a plumber, right? So let me tell you why this is not right. Let me start off with a concrete reason and then tell you a more profound reason. So very concretely, in the industrialized world, we're not running out of jobs, we're running out of workers, right? In all rich countries, right, labor forces are shrinking, right, because of low fertility, because of immigration restrictions, and you might say, well, what's the problem? We have fewer people, we need fewer jobs. But of course, we have a lot of people, many of them are retired, and we're gonna need to take care of them. We need to be productive, and so there'll be a shortage of able-bodied people to do the work that needs to be done, and we're gonna need tools to do it better. So AI can be useful for that. But let me make a second point. When most people think about what we do in the technology, the first thought is, what do we automate, right? What are we doing now that we can now use a machine to do for us? But automation is not the most profound or important use of new technology. Right? So when we learned how to fly using aircraft, that didn't automate the way we used to fly, right? We didn't fly before we had airplanes, right? The scanning electron microscope did not automate the way we used to look at subatomic particles, right? We just couldn't see them. Right? So the most important uses of technology, the way it's transformed the world, is by enabling new capabilities. Right? If you went back to ancient Greece 3,000 years ago and automated all of the things they were doing, you wouldn't have modern Singapore, right? You'd have ancient Greece without horses, right? It wouldn't have flight, it wouldn't have penicillin, it wouldn't have telecommunications, right? It wouldn't be the modern world. The modern world is what it is not because of automation, but because of all the capabilities that we have created and all the new work that goes with them. And just to emphasize, I've done recent work with my co-authors Caroline Chin, who's a graduate student, Anna Solomons of Utrecht University, and Brian Segmiller of Northwestern, looking at the growth of new work over the time. And new work, what does it mean? It means work that requires expertise, as I've been saying all along. Requires some new skill set that wasn't previously available, that's now important because of changes in technology, changes in income, changes in tastes, or changes in population structure. So, in the 1940s, the Census Bureau noticed people were using automatic welding machines. In the 1980s, they were controlling remotely piloted vehicles, those are drones, or doing cybersecurity. Or they became expert in tattooing, or conference planning, or as sommeliers. These are all new types of expertise, for a while at least, that are scarce and they're valuable. Some of them are fleeting, some are not. How important is this? Well, in 1940, we had about 50 million US workers doing the jobs that existed in 1940. In 2018, we had about 60 million workers doing the jobs that existed in 1940, but we had about 160 million workers. About 60% of work, as we can estimate it, is new, meaning it requires forms of expertise and specialization that were not present 80 years earlier. Okay, let me end on a happy note. So here are the questions I think we should be asking, right? Will we use AI to empower and extend expertise, or instead use it to value expertise and displace workers? There's a lot of choice, right? There's a lot of different ways to apply it, and how we build it out and where we invest is a choice. It's not the AI that will be deciding. If we want to extend expertise, how do we make that happen? I would say this is an R&D opportunity, right? That we don't know. It's very early days, and figuring out how to use this tool well and what it's good for is going to take investment, it's going to take discovery, it's going to take vision. And we're going to shape it, right? Industry, government, universities, trade unions will all make a set of decisions that affect how we deploy this technology. So the future depends on the decisions we make at present. So let me make the final point. My Whirlpool washing machine has more processing power than the Apollo lunar guidance system. And that allows me to start the rinse cycle from anywhere on the planet using my smartphone. And that is not an impressive use of technology, right? Going to the moon with a small amount of processing power, that's impressive, right? Starting my washing machine from my phone in Singapore doesn't really help me. I still need to go into my laundry room to get the laundry, right? So the point I want to make with this is the most valuable uses of technology are not backfilling and automating things we already do, but creating moonshots. And so in thinking about AI, we should think beyond replicating human capabilities, of which we have many. We should be looking for moonshots, ways we can use this tool to extend our capabilities. And as we do that, that will be the best application of AI, and that's where the great potential rests. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Autor. May I please ask that you take a seat at the sofa area on stage. We now come to the discussion and Q&A session, which will be moderated by Professor Steve Davis. Professor Davis is the Thomas W. and Susan B. Ford Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution and Senior Fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. Professor Davis, please.
Well, thank you, David, for that very engaging and provocative discussion. Because you're a wise man, you didn't make any concrete predictions in this area, but nonetheless, I want to make one,
okay,
and get your reaction to it. And I'm not going to be super precise, but at least in one respect, a little bit more than you were. And my prediction is that these technologies, as impressive and as potentially transformative as they are, will not transform labor markets much in the next 5 to 10 years, and certainly won't generate a lot of disruption. So let me explain some of the reasons why, and then I want to get your reaction. Reason one is just all of the major technological transformations that come to mind: steam power, electricity, the microprocessor, and so on, were characterized by patterns where the transformative effect in the labor market and how we do work unfolded over decades, long after the technologies themselves developed. And unless there's some reason to think that will be different for say, generative AI, then I'd like to know if you think that's different, then why. And if I remember right, ChatGPT just came out less than 2 years ago. So we're still in very early stages. So that's reason one. Reason two, your protein structure example is very interesting. I think it's one of the most impressive applications of AI to date. But it's also characterized by applying the learning technology that comes with AI to a database that had been accumulated over decades, as I understand it, through past human efforts. And many of the potentially transformative applications of AI require the building of new data sets. So automated vehicles is one. That seems like an easier task in some respects than protein folding, but we've got to develop the data. Your Chexpert example was very interesting in that it revealed some of the subtleties that arise in trying to make this actually work. And then, so that's point three. And then point four, and this I'll just end here, although I could go on with more, your nurse practitioner example. As you were clear to point out, that process of nurses, effectively registered nurses, taking on some of the tasks previously performed by doctors, was very heavily resisted by doctors for decades. That kind of political economy dynamic is going to play out in all of the other areas that you optimistically identified where there can be kind of upgrading of the effective expertise levels that people bring to jobs. Okay, so with all of that, I guess one last thing on this, which is, my sense is that the potential for AI, insofar as it will displace jobs or hollow out parts of the middle of the wage distribution, it's more like bank tellers and ATMs than it is like automation in the manufacturing sector. And job loss in the manufacturing sector, we've got lots of evidence on this, including by you, that's often a very painful process for the job losers and the communities. Bank tellers, not so much. So all of this says we got time. Things are going to unfold more slowly than you might think. Let me get your reaction.
Sure. So it wouldn't be fun if I didn't disagree. So let me do that. So I certainly agree with the fundamental point that these things take time, and there's a huge time lag between sort of, wow, eureka, it can do this, and when it actually economically matters. However, I think this one, is closer to mobile telephony than it is to the steam engine, right? In that mobile telephony now, not very old, more than half the world's population owns a smartphone, which is remarkable, right? And really the smartphone is only 15 years old, right? Why will this one roll out quickly? Because it runs on existing infrastructure, right? We don't need to build train tracks. We don't need to build new factories, right? This just, we just need data centers and internet piping and connectivity, which you already have. And also, I think the demand for it is very broad, right? I think this is a technology like mobile telephony that will be at least as important in the developing world as it is in the rich world, because it supplies something that is even scarcer, which is these forms of machine-augmented expertise. Just like mobile telephony was more important for the developing world because it provided long-distance communication and banking and information on prices that in the rich world we had, not as conveniently, but we already had them. So I think it can roll out relatively, but again, I don't think in 5 or 10 years it'll be, transformative is an overused word, and I was trying to make fun of it actually at the initial offering. But will it be disruptive? It will be disruptive for some. So first of all, right now, and this is not intrinsic to technology, but the wholesale theft of intellectual property by artificial intelligence will be extremely disruptive for content creators, for musicians, for authors, and so on. And that's a regulatory issue, but one that we should fix quickly, right? It's like the music industry in the days of Napster, before we had Apple Music, before we had Spotify, which is people stealing other people's stuff and selling it again or giving it away, right? So that's a type of disruption that's not intrinsic. That's a problem of social organization. I think there are certain occupations that will be substantially displaced and disrupted, and that's almost always true. And it doesn't have to be 20% of people, right? Because we know that it's felt so acutely for the people for whom it happens. So I think that's why I say people should be more optimistic than they are, because the optimism is the potential for what we can do with it, the new applications. They should be worried about the transitional costs, because those will exist as well. Any point I want to end on there? Yeah. So I think. So I think. But I do think we have here's one reason. Let me end on this final point. Here's one reason why it could be a really good thing, right? So a lot of the U.S. and really the industrialized world post-Second World War prosperity came from incredibly rapid productivity growth in making stuff, right? Cars and plumbing and appliances and airplanes and so on. And we have really played out a lot of those gains. Actually, the share of economic activity that's just making stuff has fallen. And where have we had low productivity growth? Education, healthcare, law, design, and those are low productivity activities that require lots and lots of expensive labor, like us. If we could get better at those things by doing them more efficiently and enabling less educated workers to do more of them, and by less educated I mean like the nurse practitioners, right? That would be a really big deal, right? 1% productivity growth in healthcare matters a lot more than 1% productivity growth in making cars, because healthcare is a bigger part of economic activity. So I see real upside, not just disruption. I agree it will take a while to unfold.
Yeah, thanks. I also see lots of upside. So just to make that clear, Our particular industry is ripe for disruption, but the forces of resistance are strong.
Absolutely.
Let me open up the floor here and see who else has a comment or a question for David.
I don't want to have to cold call anyone, so please ask a question.
Well, let me go back then, and you didn't fully address the other thing I said, which is, insofar as there is, let's say, displacement of call center workers because they become so much more productive in your example, and I don't know whether it's the case that the demand for their services is particularly elastic or inelastic, but if it's inelastic, then there'll be fewer call center workers. Yep. But they're dispersed widely, and I don't think those people have skills that make it so hard for them to translate to another job the way a manufacturer did. If you're a successful call center worker, you probably have reasonably good interpersonal skills, which means there's a whole bunch of service sector jobs that you could take on, and that might be different for somebody who lost a job as a machine worker in a manufacturing plant. So is that a correct perception of AI, that it's going to have, to the extent it displaces jobs, it's going to be rather dispersed across different parts of the economy, occupation, industry, space, and won't be so concentrated in downturns as manufacturing job losses typically were?
Yeah, no, so manufacturing is special because it's so geographically concentrated, right? So there was never a clerical capital of the United States, right? So there was never, we don't talk about a clerical shock, yet the actual effect of computerization on the clerical occupation was really substantial. Took a while, but you didn't notice it as much because it happened everywhere, whereas manufacturing job loss was extremely geographically concentrated, so it was really and very abrupt. But I do think there are some occupations that will be heavily disrupted, but let me talk about what I think is the potential, right? So if we could use AI to enable more people to do computer coding without a bachelor's degree in computer science, if more people could do skilled medical vocational tasks, right, without having to go for 10 years of medical education, they only need 4 or 5. If more people could do legal tasks, if more people could do, if you're a contractor and you were doing design of a house, right, if you could do a broader variety of design and engineering services, right, this would be really good. And so I think we'll know we're successful with AI, if we are successful, when we see people who are not at the elite, right, doing more of those skilled decision-making professional tasks and competing more with the highly educated, right? We've had 5 decades, it's been a great 5 decades to be highly educated, right? We've had a wonderful run of inequality. We've all been on the upside of it. But actually, it's time we had more competition, right? And if people who have appropriate expertise, like those weekend hobbyists doing electrical work, and get the right tools, they can do more of this work better. And that will be, in my opinion, a better world, one that will refill that middle, a different middle, but using a set of skills that are not quite as rarefied.